In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gathered to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome back to Tholos Talks. This is episode 6 of Coffee, Trade, and Tech. I'm Jake Jennings, chair of the Tech and Trade practice at Basilinna. I'm thrilled to welcome Kendra Schaefer, partner and head of tech policy research at Trivium China, and senior fellow here at Basilinna Institute. Kendra has been tracking China's tech policy evolution from Beijing for over 2 decades, and her insights on China's AI governance and development strategy are essential for anyone trying to understand the current global AI landscape. She's the chief editor of Trivium's Tech Daily newsletter and has briefed Fortune 500 executives and policymakers across the US, EU, and Asia on China tech policy. Today, we will take a deep dive into the future of Chinese AI policy, open source strategy, and what it all means for US-China tech competition. Kendra, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here.
Normally, we do kind of an intro and talk about your background, Trivium, but all we're hearing is what's going on with the US-China AI race and who's winning.
Yeah, okay, so we're starting with the billion-dollar question. Well, I'll try to answer that one by answering an even bigger question, which is, what is the promise of AI? In my view, the promise of AI is that it's going to allow us to distribute and deploy our limited resources with much greater efficiency, right? Our human resources, our capital resources, our natural resources, our creative resources, our attention, and that efficiency gain is expected to bring about significant economic gain and ideally gains in social well-being. So to my mind, the ultimate answer to the question of who's winning the AI race comes down to the question of who is applying AI for maximum economic gain and who is actually reaping these kind of gains in social well-being based on AI deployment. Right. Now, we're so early in the AI development cycle that nobody actually knows the answer to those questions or how to calculate that. Actually talked to some economists a few days ago that told me that global economists at the country level are starting to try to answer that question themselves, right? How do you calculate the contribution of AI to the economy? So since there's no commonly accepted method available for measuring progress towards the real goal, we are left measuring progress towards measuring the AI race, rather, by looking at boring stuff like which country has developed the best large language model. And from that perspective, as somebody much smarter than me said the other day, the US is winning in AI, but China is winning in open source AI. I think that sounds about right. And I guess we'll get into more of a discussion on that later.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting that you pitch it as a who is utilizing or leveraging AI the best in order to determine kind of who is going to reap the most economic gains from that. It does remind me a little bit of the race for 5G, where all the countries in telecom were kind of racing to, fill their 5G networks. But the real question was, what are the apps that are going to be then developed that can actually make use of the increased speed, efficiency, and latency? It's interesting how the development follows kind of a very similar pattern. Build the technology, and then you roll out, find out what can we use it for.
Oh, exactly. And, even more than that, I'd say that the press is usually way too early to the question of who's winning the race. I think in terms of 5G, only just now are we starting to see some of the gains that are being reaped from early development of that technology, right? So years after, 6, 7 years after that race really got started, I think the same thing will happen on AI. Everyone wants to know the answer now. In reality, it'll be a decade from now where we get a clear view of, who's ahead in that way.
Interesting. It definitely will be fun to watch and hopefully be a part of. So kind of going back to kind of your start in tech policy in China, how did you end up in Beijing? What drew you to China and positioned you for this expertise you now have?
I certainly didn't start my career expecting to end up where I'm at now. I think like most people, I ended up in China sort of due to a happy accident. I first went in 2002 and I was 19, intending to do some traveling before I went to college. Long story short, I loved it. I ended up going to college in Beijing. I paid my way through college with many odd jobs, but one of those jobs was coding. I was a coder and a nerd kid in the sort of early days of the internet. And by the time I graduated, I was already working in e-commerce and import-export. I later started my own digital agency. I was working in Beijing. I was working first with SMEs and later with, Fortune 500s and doing a lot of writing about how networks worked in China, usability and interface design for the China market. Anyway, long story short, since the state and state regulation play such a large role in determining how networks function there and how technology is built there, I ended up spending a lot of time dealing with network regulation. And so when Trivium was founded as a policy consultancy, I was asked to come on and do two things. One is sort of oversee our IT networks, and the other one is oversee our tech policy research. So I was in China for 20 years. I moved back to the US a couple of years ago. So a bit of a winding road towards this place, but here I am.
So at 19, literally just going to China for some traveling, did you speak Mandarin at the time?
I had no idea what I was doing. I went to do a gap year just to have a good time. I thought it would be interesting. I had a friend of mine at the time who had gone and said it was very interesting. And so I had no intention of staying at least beyond a year. And 1 year turned into 20.
Oh my God. Wow. That's definitely a journey and a story. And you're back in the US now. Has that transitioned been a little bit of a cultural shock?
It was a huge culture shock. I was sort of forced to come back. I came back at the end of COVID. To be honest, if COVID hadn't happened, I probably would have lived, retired, and died in Beijing. As situation had it, I think most people in the world experienced some kind of life shift during that time, and so did I. So coming back was a very big shock. And both countries, I love Beijing, I love the US. Both countries are enjoyable for different reasons.
So then you joined Trivium. Now tell me you didn't join them as their help desk IT person. You're also dual hatting with their tech policy.
That's right. So I came on board. I know the founders from before they founded the company. And so we actually had a funny moment where one of the founders, before he started, sat me down for a beer and explained his idea to start a policy consultancy and said, we're going to start this policy consultancy. Here's the idea. What do you think? And I said, terrible idea. Do not do that. That sounds awful. And he said, why? And I gave him my reasons. And a couple weeks later, he called me back. He said, well, how about you come on board and solve those problems for us? So, yeah. So that's kind of, and I went, oh, I didn't really consider that. And so that's how I ended up doing it. But I didn't want to get pigeonholed in just IT. I ended up sort of taking on the policy research role. And now we spend all our time reading, Chinese government documents on tech and data.
Tell us a little bit more about Trivium. What is their secret sauce, if you will? And, how do you distinguish the actual policies from the noise that a number of us hear about?
Well, that's a really good question. So what we do is we monitor Chinese state output at scale. So if the Chinese government released something yesterday, we probably saw it today. And that gives us a pretty holistic picture of China's policymaking cycle. Very often, I think what happens in China policy analysis is that one big policy will attract a bunch of attention globally. Made in China 2025 is a good example. You're, I'm sure, very familiar with that one. Came out, and it was a very controversial industrial policy that came out in 2015. And then that policy gets so much attention that it gets not only taken out of context, but also understood through the lens of U.S. thinking, U.S. priorities, U.S. values. And I think the way that we monitor policy is able to give us a little bit of a different view. Hundreds of policies come across our desk on a daily basis. 99% of those are not about AI or US-China trade or hot button issues. It's like soil erosion and food safety and adjusting the rules for land purchases and all of the kind of minutia of governance. And through that, you're able to develop a sort of intuitive sense for how the Chinese government functions overall, how it thinks, how it makes decisions. Most importantly, what kind of problems it's trying to solve and how it perceives its own problems. Policy is an attempted solution to a perceived problem. So if you understand how the state thinks about its own problems, it becomes much easier to predict what kind of policies it's going to attempt in order to solve those problems. Honestly, our model is just really common sense. Anyone could do it, but very few companies or organizations want to sit and be inundated by Chinese government documents all day. So we just kind of take that burden off of everyone else.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when, the CAICT rolled out, made in China 2025. At the time, that was a very, I may say, a dense set of policy papers, writings. Was a top-down directive, but yet it was really at the ground level, at the staff level, developed and then rolled out iteratively. Is that your sense on how most policymaking is done still? What's it like for policymaking in China?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, you can usually see major policies coming because they're smaller policies, regional announcements, little moves in that. The same with the US, right? Because people just aren't watching the China space in the same way. Tiny little moves, a building conversation, a sort of building political momentum, usually for a year, 2 years, sometimes 5 years before a major policy hits the stage. And yet we don't really see it until that big, very often, right? US policymakers don't even know it's happening until bam, this major shift happens from the China side and they go, how did we not see this coming? Usually it was signaled prodigiously. And so for something like Made in China 2025, you're absolutely right. There was before that, there was 5 years of conversation about how China should shift its industrial policy. That policy didn't come out of the blue, but it shocked everyone in the West because it seemed to say China is no longer interested in, we're going to preference our domestic companies and manufacturers over foreign manufacturers. We're going to try to localize everything. And that was the real controversial aspect of that policy. But really, for 5 years before that, there'd been a lot of micro conversations at various levels about how China was too reliant on, certain aspects of foreign technology and foreign manufacturing and how they didn't want to fall into the middle income trap and how they wanted to upgrade the manufacturing industry. And that was, the culmination of this kind of long conversation about that. So you're absolutely right. There's usually a long, slow build to, a major policy release there, just as there is here.
So kind of jumping to from 2015 to today with the AI boom, because I think everybody and, a lot of folks were shocked when DeepSeek rolled out their R1 model that was relatively on par with Western-based models, but a lot cheaper using kind of older semiconductors. Was that the same type of policy building that led to the DeepSeek moment, or is there something else going on here?
I get that question a lot. I think it's a real mix of things. First and foremost, I think the Western tech community hates to admit it sometimes, but Chinese platform companies are good at building digital technology.
Yes.
They're just good at it, right? You have several big and well-funded firms. You've got Ali and Tencent and Baidu. They've been conducting AI-related R&D for many years now, long before the emergence of ChatGPT. So it's really no surprise that they've kind of emerged on the bleeding edge. More than that, China's broader market environment is very ripe for AI adoption and proliferation. You have a highly digitized society, mass adoption of digital technologies and mobile, strong digital economy, strong digital infrastructure. So in that sense, I think the AI boom is really just a product of organic development. That said, you also have a government that has made AI development a priority for at least 10 years, speaking of 2015, right? The 13th five-year plan, which was also written around 2015, identified AI as a big strategic emerging industry for China. In 2017, right, the state released the Next Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan, which basically indicated the state wanted to see China become a world leader in AI by 2030. You've got a government that spent the last 20 years pushing very hard upgrading China's digital infrastructure. One company can't do that alone, right? The market can't do that alone. So big satellite internet push, big fiber optic cable push, as you know very well, big mobile network push. In many ways, it's both, right? There's a lot of innovative dynamism from tech firms, and then there's also supportive government policy.
So on those policies earlier, you mentioned that, they're trying to solve a problem. Are there specific problems that, back in, 2017 that the government was looking at trying to address, or is it more of a socioeconomic efficiency issue?
There was the social economic efficiency issue, but there also were specific issues in the innovation environment the government was trying to address. The biggest one, I think, was that most firms in China spent a very tiny percentage of their revenue on basic research and even on applied research. But the numbers were incredibly low, especially compared to the US. I think it was like 3%, 5%, something like that. Whereas, I think Huawei now is the largest contributor to basic research, and I think they spend 11% of their budget on those types of research initiatives. And so US firms typically come in much higher than that. And the government has spent really 15 years trying to change that and to encourage and incentivize companies to spend their money on basic research. Only recently have they started having a little bit of success on that front.
You kind of jumped, we're talking a little bit AI, the DeepSeek on the software side. Then you
Yes.
brought up Huawei on the semiconductor side. Do you see a split between the hardware and the software, or is kind of all moving together in terms of investment, research, and development?
Well, for many years, software was the main game in town for China. Most of the sort of boom in the platform economy, software took the lead. Now, of course, the state has sort of started focusing on and funneling money towards the hardware space, mostly because that's where China needs to shore up its weaknesses, right? China's particularly weak on the hardware. And so the focus, at least from the government and now necessarily from industry, is a little bit more on the hardware side. So I think really the investment money is currently focused on hardware as a major bottleneck. Then again, software is a major strength, and therefore investors, particularly private investors, would much rather put their money on something that's more guaranteed to, generate a return. And that, as far as China is concerned, is the software side of things.
China's created an AI framework. I know they have a program called the AI Registry. Tell our listeners, how does that program and regulatory model work, and how are companies adapting to the registry and their approvals?
Right. So this touches on how China governs its AI domestically, right? When companies roll out AI in China, how do they do that? And how does the state control it? It's pretty interesting. Because China controls the internet so stringently, it requires Chinese AI companies to register large models with the state and also to register certain types of generative AI algorithms with the state. And that information is a matter of public record. And that basically means, because it's a matter of public record, that means that there's a public list of all LLMs and many other algorithms operating in a public facing capacity in China. So we did a research project earlier this year where we collected that data and analyzed it. And what it showed was that, as you might expect, there's a whole bunch of different types of companies and organizations developing AI in China, both in the private sector and in the public sector. The major players in the private sector include, platform companies like Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent and NetEase and ByteDance, all the companies you've heard of. Additionally, quite a few major hardware makers are building up those tools as well. Huawei, Inspur, iFlytek, SenseTime have released various LLMs. And you've also got a crop of these new school AI startups, right? That's most notably DeepSeek, but also Zhipu, Baichuan Intelligence, Minimax, and others.
And I just said, and Quinn.
Yes, Quinn is Alibaba's open source model. So, and then Ali's got a whole bunch of, actually, I mean, that out of those companies that I mentioned, Alibaba and Tencent are releasing the most number of models, of which Quinn is one. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they're doing the most innovative work in China. Interestingly enough, the smaller startups like DeepSeek that are kind of just focusing on developing like one signature tool seem to be doing more of the bleeding edge work. And then you, of course, have a lot of projects developed by the state-owned enterprises like China Mobile, State Grid, right, electric power provider, some by state-backed universities, by state-funded companies, by state labs. We basically estimate that about 22% of the tools coming out of China have some kind of affiliation with the state, even if that's a very loose affiliation. So mostly private sector led with a significant but not overwhelming state involvement. That's essentially what has emerged. And all of those tools have to be registered via this registry, giving us this very interesting view into what's actually going on.
So from those, I think it's what, 1,800, maybe, 3,000 models that have been approved. Are you getting a sense of how is China's government measuring the success, if you will, of those AI platforms? Is it based on engineering performance, or are they also looking at market uptake and how are they being actually used to solve some of these problems or monetizing those assets?
And that's a wonderful question that I don't think anybody's answered and that I don't have a great answer for. The state has not, I don't think we have either, but the state has not defined a good series of metrics to measure the success of specific tools. Primarily, what the state has done is set interesting policy targets around things like how much revenue the AI sector is generating, how much computing power, particularly intelligent computing power suitable for AI training, is available on a per capita basis. This is pretty interesting. They're targeting a certain amount of compute available by encouraging the development of data centers. And then also setting targets around how much storage is available, data storage is available. So some pretty interesting, state targets and metrics. But in terms of them lining up their KPIs with the goal of actually having AI contribute to the economy, I think you're right to point out that they haven't done a good job at that.
Although I think it's fair, we are somewhat in the infancy of AI
Exactly.
as well. So it just
Yeah.
seems like it's been here forever for some of us. It's interesting also to note that, if you look at comparing Chinese AI models to Western based, Chinese are predominantly open source, if not, entirely open source, whereas the US more of a proprietary approach. How do you see that playing out? And I guess the other part of the question is, a lot of those Chinese AI models are using Western-based open source platforms. Do we expect that to continue over time?
Wow. Okay. So the open source question is one of the most interesting ones at present, right? Because the Chinese state has been encouraging companies to pursue open source projects for at least 15 years now, right? Maybe even 20 years, specifically as a way to sort of reduce reliance on foreign technology. And that has included things like open source operating system initiatives like OpenEuler and OpenKylin, which were backed by, state-linked firms and ministries. Those have been around for years. And they were originally developed as China sort of attempted to reduce reliance on iOS and Windows, right? Unsuccessfully until now. More recently, we also saw the state support RISC-V, which is an open source alternative chipset architecture to ARM and x86, more on the sort of hardware side or the firmware side. And the state supported open source for many reasons. One, as I mentioned, of course, was to reduce reliance on foreign technologies. But the other reason is because the state believed that open source technologies would attract users, including foreign users, and that it was China's opportunity to sort of collect international market share. Unfortunately for the state, reducing reliance on foreign technologies and making Chinese technologies more attractive to on the international stage is something that the government cared about more than companies cared about. So those efforts had not really gotten a ton of traction at all until quite recently. Now, tech companies never really picked up the open source ball and ran with it, except as sort of a side project or a curiosity. And consumers were not adopting domestic open source technologies, not really. But the interest, of course, in open source started to pick up in recent years, particularly after sanctions on Huawei and ZTE, and even more notably after the US started export controlling semiconductors. And all of a sudden, companies are sort of forced to consider open source as a way of getting around those restrictions. And then here comes DeepSeek, which has proved both the state, rightly or wrongly, but has proved this idea right, has like proved the state's idea and has sort of proved to private companies that this is a viable model, and particularly a viable model if you don't have the best tool set on the market, right? You're not OpenAI and you're not Google. Why on earth would anyone spend any money on your product? Why would somebody adopt your technology if you're pay to play also, if your licensing is very restrictive? So permissive licensing and financially free model is extremely attractive in many ways to many developers that don't want to sort of, get locked into licensing. And then, of course, DeepSeek's success in this regard has sort of started a movement. Now, the DeepSeek is open source. It's the best tool in the China market. There's no incentive for the second best tool in the China market to be closed. So now everybody's open source. And it's sort of I think in the last month alone, we've seen 10 announcements of Chinese companies that have been sort of forced to open source their models based on DeepSeek's success. So it's a really fascinating situation.
What's the developer culture like? And the reason I ask that is I did hear in China, I did hear a story going around. The DeepSeek management team was debating whether or not to publish its model on GitHub on open source. And while they were having this discussion, a coder and basically went ahead and just published it. And so there was your answer. So I don't know if that's true or not. I'd be, you'll have to find out if it is, but have you heard something similar? And what's your experience with like I said, the developer culture?
I mean, the developer culture, I spent quite a few years when I had my digital agency going to a lot of Chinese developer meetups and stuff like that. I felt like the culture was very similar. Developers and their attitudes tend to go beyond politics. They transcend politics. They transcend everything else. And I'm sure engineers are the same, right? Like the culture doesn't matter, the tech, nothing matters except the technology and how interested we all are in, building this technology and hacking this technology. And that was kind of the same vibes. But you do bring up an interesting point about GitHub, which is like, I think you and I were talking earlier about the fact that China's got this sort of GitHub alternative called Git, which is also another domestic sort of code hosting and collaboration platform. It is a shameless GitHub clone. The interface looks almost identical. It's very similar. And it was a private project at first, but it did receive the sort of blessing of regulators, particularly MIIT, China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, because as a platform, it was sort of providing an alternative to these Western platforms. The interesting relationship there is that for all other social media platforms in China, they have a sort of captive audience because their Western alternatives have been blocked by the Great Firewall, right? Chinese users can't easily get on Facebook. They can't easily get on X. They can't easily get on. So they use the domestic, at first they were sort of forced to use the domestic platform. And now those domestic platforms have become much more aligned with user tastes in China. And, even if you unblocked Facebook, people wouldn't, I don't think you would get a sudden influx of Chinese users onto it. And the state would love to block GitHub. They'd love to do it, but they cannot. Because what you're basically doing if you block GitHub is you are cutting Chinese developers and innovators off from global code systems. More than that, GitHub, direct connections to GitHub sit under a lot of programs. There are a lot of development life cycles that are dependent on GitHub. So when a developer is building something, GitHub hosted code is plugged directly into that develop it, test it, move it to production, launch it live process. And you
Grab this
probably
module or that module, bake it in.
precisely. Precisely. So I think you would just blow up. It's impossible for a regulator to know what's going to happen, what programs or software they're going to explode if they turn that off. And so I think they're absolutely unable to turn it off. Anyway, the GitHub story is an interesting one. Yeah.
I guess taking a step back from the strategic and global implications,
Yeah.
on the couple of weeks ago, the U.S. rolled out its AI action plan. A few days later, China was hosting AI global conference in Shanghai, and they rolled out their, I think it was 13-point plan. It would appear to be, Western components, multi-stakeholder engagement, interoperability, international standards. Just curious, how do you see that playing out in real time in China from the development perspective?
That's also an interesting question. So first of all, just to frame up the question a little more, you've got the U.S. side, which is the Trump administration just a couple weeks ago released this AI action plan, essentially outlined a vision for how the U.S. was going to compete with China, but also really just sort of spur domestic innovation in AI. And then China, a couple days later, released also an action plan, but the two of them are a little bit apples and oranges because the U.S. action plan was very much like a Chinese industrial policy. It was more about, how the United States is going to sort of, build more data centers and empower its researchers and encourage the development of open source. China's already released tons of plans like that. As we said, there's 10 years of AI policy going back, ages and ages covering all of those issues. So what China put out a couple weeks ago was really an outline for how they wanted to see countries globally work together to govern artificial intelligence and essentially how we should collaborate together. And this isn't the first time China has put out a document like this, where they basically tried to be thought leaders and encourage other countries to sort of to sign on with and follow along with some of the ideas that they had proposed in terms of how countries should collaborate. And what China's doing is setting itself up as a total counterpoint to the U.S. point of view on the international stage. The U.S. point of view is get on, but, and especially in terms of how they deal with allies and partners and adversaries, right? The U.S. point of view, according to Trump's action plan, is it's going to be our way or the highway. We're going to set the rules for international collaboration and sort of AI governance globally. You can get on the boat or you can get out. We're going to control whether, you should buy our technology. We're going to, try to push you to buy our technology. We're going to try to push you not to use Chinese technology. And the Chinese side, so it's very aggressive. And the Chinese side was really quite the opposite. It was almost this sort of utopian kumbaya, right? All countries should work together on AI to honor the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We should create a diverse ecosystem. We should actively pool our data into an international resource that everybody can use. We should join hands and address climate change, right? So, a
And
lit-
protect national sovereignty.
of course, protect national sovereignty. Yes, that's the critical one. You're exactly right to point that out. The most important message in all of China's advocacy on international AI is this idea that tech development shouldn't leave out the little guy, that nobody should be left behind. And that's a very self serving point of view because what they're actually saying is you shouldn't deny us access to semiconductors because what you're doing is stymieing our ability to technologically develop. And that is a crime, right? That is a egregious offense. So they're setting themselves up as the sort of champion of all countries, marginalized and left behind by technological development, and in so doing, sort of serving their own interests as well. That's the
It'll
breakdown.
be interesting how it plays out. So I've had a couple of other guests, and we had the trade guys on from CSIS, and kind of their point is the technology war with China between the U.S. and China will really play out in third world countries, not just the global South, but globally. Like, how are countries going to pick and choose their technologies?
So the strategy that Chinese tech firms have employed to gain market share in the global South, right, involves offering cheap products of adequate quality with low barriers to entry, meaning less restrictions on their use, less oversight, less moralizing, whatever it is. And then also, Chinese companies have also had a sort of willingness to develop or adapt that technology, customize it to local conditions, whether it's local language, local rollouts, local implementation, in a way that US firms sometimes are not. Sometimes it's like, this is our product package. Do you want this? And if the answer is no, then they're like, okay. So when it comes to AI, if they follow that same strategy, I could see that being very attractive to the global South, right? And so that also depends in part on the US. Are we going to, our strategy seems to be under both Trump and Biden. I mean, this isn't a current administration issue, but our strategy under both administrations was, to some extent, we're going to push everybody not to use Chinese technologies. We're going to push people to adopt our idea or else. I don't know how much juice that strategy has. I think it probably has quite a bit more juice. There's a lot more leverage that we have to sort of force an outcome. And yet, the more strings that our technology comes attached with, the less attractive it's going to be over time. So I actually don't see a major change in the sort of strategic positions of both countries in that respect.
Yeah, it was interesting reading through the U.S. AI Action Plan, a few references to, providing financing for rolling out the full stack of U.S. AI technologies. Again, reminiscent of the 5G debate between what was known as ORAN, Open
Yeah.
Radio Access Network, versus Chinese technology, Huawei. And I think a few, crumbs of financing made available under a couple of the acts under the Biden administration, but we're talking massive investment size. Is it realistic to think that the U.S. is going to be able to essentially, finance U.S. technology globally?
That's more your area of expertise than mine. Right back at you. What do you think?
Given what we saw already with ORAN and 5G, I think it's going to be challenging at best.
I think I agree.
If we continue to kind of step back, a lot of the focus has been on large language modules. There's a whole host of area. I know at, reports at the China AI conference in Shanghai, you saw pictures of kind of robots racing, different types of focus on robotics, autonomous vehicles. Where do you see AI in China, playing out in kind of more of these other technology areas?
You make a very good point. One of the core focus areas of AI, I have a couple answers to that question, but one of the core focus areas of AI, as far as the state is concerned, they're very interested in the idea of embodied intelligence. In other words, an AI brain in a robotics body. And I think the state is excited about that for two reasons, and likely to support that with subsidies for two reasons. One is that China's already good at both of those things. They're good at robotics. They've got a strong robotics industry. They also have a strong, increasingly strong AI industry. And therefore, there's a lot of gain to be had by marrying those two technologies together. And secondly, if you do marry those two technologies together, what are they good for? Industrial upgrading. That is where you get smart factories. It is where you get, logistics warehouses that run autonomously. It is where you get all these kind of
Productivity growth gains.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly. Productivity gain. I mean, I think that's really the sort of focus for China. I will throw a weird curveball in here, which is that another area that is embodied intelligence adjacent that no one is really talking about, and yet we see all the time in China policy over the last year has been a real uptick in state interest and support for this, is something that policymakers are calling the low altitude economy. The low altitude economy is the emerging trade in drones, essentially drone logistics, right? Services using drones and flying cars, basically flying passenger vehicles called eVTOLs, right? They're basically giant drones that a person can sit in, and sometimes they're autonomously piloted. Sometimes there's an actual pilot behind the wheels. Again, what you've got is AI married with a robotics technology and also like a hardware tech that China is already quite good at. DJI is obviously a very strong drone maker, but there's a bunch of other companies like EHang that are now building these eVTOLs, these sort of giant sort of service and logistics and passenger carrying drones. And then the state is doing things like creating regulations to set aside airspace for those vehicles and also to create landing pads and parking lots, right? Where are these things gonna park and where are they gonna stop? You're starting to see city governments get in there. So that's really where there's two areas I see the future headed.
The low altitude economy, interesting. You talked about the AI brains in the robotics. How much of the large language model, the processing, would you actually see in the brains, or would there be like a wireless tether connectivity that's driving that as well?
Well, it depends. I mean, that actually depends a lot on chip upgrading. A lot of these new sort of AI-enabled devices are essentially running on a lot of the processing is being done on device, on the edge, right? It's being done locally without necessarily a network connection back to any cloud service. A big and growing industry around chips that are designed specifically for edge devices because of the expected explosion of things like drones, but also, autonomous vehicles have to run AI tools on board. Of course, when you think of it in terms of autonomous vehicles, it makes perfect sense. A car is driving through an area with no cell coverage. It cannot depend on cloud access to, if it's powered by AI, it cannot just depend on cloud access and oops, sorry, you have no internet connection, your car doesn't work. So all of those things have to function on device. And thus we're seeing a real move from cloud computing to sort of explosion in IoT and edge devices. Yeah.
Edge device. That's fascinating. The one thing that U.S. companies or policymakers consistently miss about China's AI path.
I think in terms of what the incorrect assumptions are, I hear a lot of conversations in DC that start from the assumption, I guess this is bringing this back full circle, start from the assumption that we're running the same race that China's running for the same reasons. We assume that China's main goal is to run a race against us. And thus, our main goal is to run a race against them. And I don't actually think, I mean, I've sort of talked around this throughout this episode, but I don't actually think China's main concern is running a race against us. As I said, China's primary interest in digital technologies for the last 20 years has been as a tool to upgrade traditional industries, particularly manufacturing, right? And the reason that is because China is facing down serious economic headwinds right now, most notably slowing GDP growth and a severely shrinking population. The shrinking population issue is much more severe, I think, than most people realize. Right now, about 14% of the population is over the age of 65, so retirement age, no longer working. By 2040, that is supposed to explode to 35% of the population. So in the next 15 years, they're going to lose 20% of the working population. It's like, geez. So if you're facing something like that, when you know you're about to have way fewer resources to work with, fewer people means less productivity, of course, then you need an efficiency boosting technology, and that's what AI is. So really, China's running a race against the clock. It's running a race against itself, first and foremost. Now, that's not to say China's not competing with the US. Of course they are. But the primary concern is tick, 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 tick. Population is slowing. And what does that mean if China's growth stalls out? What does that mean if economic, stagnation sets in? So the state is really running that race, I think, first and foremost. That is the primary concern. And then secondarily, the international or geopolitical competition.
Yeah, it really does bring us full circle solving problems.
Yeah, exactly. It really does.
So, final question for you, Kendra. Looking ahead to the next 2 to 3 years, which is an eternity in this space, what are the key policy developments or technical breakthroughs you're watching for that could significantly shift the US-China AI competition, or just simply, as you said, China's AI development to solve its own problems?
Well, I don't even know. I have a few answers to that. I mean, first, I don't know if this counts as a tech breakthrough, really, but for me, one of the most interesting questions of the time is at what point does scaling produce diminishing returns in terms of, as we've been talking about, actual social and economic value? I mean, right now, the industry is laser focused on building something bigger, and bigger equates to better. And the bigger our models are and the stronger they are, the more we're going to get out of it. And yet I've heard zero conversation either in the US or China from policymakers on what does it mean to win, right? Can you get similar gains from a bunch of small, well-deployed models that do not have to be the biggest and best models? Can you juice the economy with that? Or do you have to have the one biggest, baddest model on the block? I'm
And
not
does it
convinced.
collapse on itself?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So I'm not convinced there's not an answer to that question. And I kind of wonder, I don't think that AI is necessarily overhyped the way that some people do. I think that it is absolutely a technology that is going to completely change the way that we live and work and think and interact with each other. It will permeate every aspect of our existence. I think we're really in the middle of a sea change. So I don't think that's all nonsense. But the question of what we actually get out of it, right, I think and whether or not having, again, the big HAL computer, the big, kind of Eye of Sauron AI, whether or not that gives you a measurable benefit versus other ways, more efficient ways to deploy smaller models, I don't think that question's been answered yet, frankly. I'm interested to see how that goes.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch and to be on this journey with you as we all are on the development of AI. Kendra, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. And thank you all for tuning in to Tholos Talks.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute, available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.